Hello, my name is Emily Steimel, and I am the Public Education Coordinator at the YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment. Today, the intent of this presentation on the overview of domestic violence is to provide professionals and members in our community with the basic tools, information, skills, and resources to help us understand the complexity of domestic violence and in turn support victims and survivors in our community. For those of you who are not familiar with our agency, the Center for Safety and Empowerment, formerly known as the Battered Women's Task Force, provides free and confidential services to victims and survivors of domestic and dating violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and stalking in Shawnee, Jackson, Wabaunsee, and Brown counties in Kansas. This is a helpful list of the services that we provide at the Center for Safety and Empowerment. We understand that domestic violence rarely happens during regular business hours, so please note that advocates are available 24/7 through our free and confidential helpline at 1-888-822-2983. All services that we provide at the Center for Safety and Empowerment, from our food and hygiene product pantry to our counseling and case management, are always going to come from an empowerment-based, survivor-centered, and trauma-informed approach. We also provide other options and services for survivors, such as some material or financial assistance when available, help with filing protection orders, responding to survivors at the hospital and the law enforcement center, and more. Knowing the prevalence of domestic violence, there is a good chance that many of you listening are survivors yourself, or you have known, loved, and cared for someone who has experienced domestic and dating violence. Although this presentation is not meant to be triggering, I want you to prioritize your mental and emotional health. Please take care of yourself as you go through this experience, engage in this information. This topic can be difficult, so make sure you have opportunities for debriefing and plan some time to rest and decompress. If you are viewing and you live in or are familiar with Kansas, you might recognize this picture as being Arrowhead Stadium, where the Kansas City Chiefs play football. Arrowhead Stadium can seat over 76,000 people. So if something happened to that entire stadium full of people, would we think it was a big deal? The answer is probably yes. It would probably make national and definitely local news if some sort of phenomenon happened and impacted every single person in that stadium. But I want you to think about this in the terms of domestic violence. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, on average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. So during 1 year, this equates to more than 10 million people. So this is like filling up Arrowhead Stadium that seats over 76,000 people, filling it up 130 separate times. Unfortunately, as individuals, as a community, and even as a society, we don't always treat domestic violence like it is a big deal or take into account the impact that domestic violence can have on a person, on their life, and on their world. We all probably have directly or indirectly been impacted by domestic violence, or we know somebody who has. The fact is, domestic violence is a big deal, and it is a public health issue that creates long-term effects of physical, social, emotional, mental, and financial well-being. As we look closer into what is happening here in Kansas, we will find that domestic violence continues to impact our state, cities, communities, and neighborhoods at astounding rates. These numbers are pulled from the latest KBI report from 2020. Please note that these are only the incidents that were reported to law enforcement, which means that this is only about 30% of what is actually happening in Kansas. Domestic violence continues to be one of the most underreported crimes by far. It is also important to note that in 2020, there were 130 total homicides in Kansas, meaning that domestic violence homicides accounted for almost 30% of the total number of homicides in that year alone. 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, and 1 in 2 gender non-binary and trans-identifying individuals will experience relationship violence in their lifetime. We know that domestic and gender-based violence occurs across all ages, races, classes, identities, orientations, and ethnic backgrounds. Although it does happen at higher rates and with disproportionate impacts in Native and Indigenous communities, communities of color, Latinx communities, specifically affecting immigrants, affecting people with disabilities, and the LGBTQ plus community, specifically affecting trans women of color. While many of the experiences of survivors cut across all racial, ethnic, and class lines, due to the complex histories with these systems, due to oppression, bias, and prejudice, survivors of color and survivors within marginalized communities face increased difficulty in finding support. Learning about the dynamics of domestic violence and the resources that are available to survivors is absolutely crucial, because it is very likely that you may be the first line of response for a survivor of domestic violence. We know that survivors are more likely to disclose to a friend, family member, coworker, teacher, counselor, or a faith leader before they access help from a community service agency, such as a hospital, law enforcement center, or advocacy agency, if they ever access a service of that kind. Knowing the prevalence of domestic violence, the likelihood is great that you know someone who has experienced or is currently experiencing some form of domestic violence. Being knowledgeable of resources available in your community and being better prepared to respond will help you feel more comfortable and empowered when faced with a disclosure. So first, let's define domestic violence and address what we are referring to when we talk about domestic violence. So when you think about domestic violence, what comes to mind? For a lot of folks, it might include physical violence, emotional, mental abuse, maybe even financial or sexual abuse. Domestic violence is a pattern of behavior used to establish and maintain power and control over someone else through the means of isolation, manipulation, fear, intimidation, and more. One thing to know about the definition is that we are talking about a pattern of behavior. In other words, not just a one-time incident. Domestic violence often includes threats or use of violence and can include physical, emotional, verbal, financial, resource, sexual, reproductive, and digital abuse. This is important to note because if we are only identifying survivors and victims as people with black eyes and bruises, then we will miss a lot of victims and survivors who could benefit from services and support. Domestic violence can occur in intimate and former intimate partner relationships. Intimate relationships include current or former spouses, partners, significant others, boyfriends, and girlfriends. It can happen in gay, lesbian, and heterosexual relationships, cisgender and transgender couples, intersex and bisexual individuals, family members, those who share a child together, those who reside together in the same home or living space, and those who provide services to dependent people. If you have someone who you are working with or who you know who may benefit from services and may fit into this definition of domestic violence, please refer them to your local domestic violence advocacy agency for additional help, support, and services. We often hear a lot of misconceptions and myths around domestic violence from people who just don't fully understand the complexities and the dynamics of domestic violence. We also hear other misconceptions, such as events like the Super Bowl or holidays increase events of domestic violence because there's stress, tension, anxiety, maybe unmet expectations, financial burden, and family relationship strains. On the surface, these explanations might make a little bit of sense. However, the problem with these explanations is that they perpetuate myths around domestic violence. For instance, alcohol cannot create an abuser, and sobriety cannot cure one. Abusiveness and addiction are two very distinct problems that require two very separate solutions. And when people think that anger causes abuse, they're confusing cause and effect. There are plenty of people that experience anger that don't lead to abuse. The only way an abuser can overcome their abusiveness is to address the power and control and address their abusiveness at the core. So today we are busting myths. Although these things listed can absolutely complicate a situation and make an abusive relationship more complex, they may impact a survivor's overall safety and elevate their danger level. They may be used as a tactic to gain and maintain power and control. They may be used to justify or minimize the abuse. And they may be an aspect of why the survivor stays or why they do not leave the abusive relationship. But they at the core are not the root cause of domestic violence. In claiming that these things cause domestic violence or will cure domestic violence shifts all of the blame away from the abuser, which can be dangerous and misses the point that domestic violence is about one person exerting power and control over another person. Abusers are abusive regardless of the time of year or these other external factors. What we know is that domestic violence is rooted in power and control. This is a power and control wheel, and it can be particularly helpful in understanding the different tactics and the overall pattern of abuse and violence which are used by an abuser to establish and maintain power and control over the victim. Sometimes abusive behavior does not cause pain or even leave a bruise, but it's still unhealthy. It can make someone feel physically unsafe. Interpersonal violence is much more than just physical abuse. And very often, one or more violent incidents are accompanied by an array of other types of abuse. Often, it is difficult to identify the various forms of abuse, particularly when they are indirect or not as obvious as physical violence. Yet these tactics are collectively used to firmly establish a pattern of intimidation and control in the relationship. Furthermore, the purple ring that goes around the outside of the wheel is what holds the wheel together. And this is the threat of physical and sexual violence if the abuser feels like they are losing power and control. The cycle of violence is a theory around domestic violence that was created by Lenore Walker. Abuse in an intimate relationship most often occurs in patterns that can sometimes become predictive to the survivor. Survivors start to become aware of the warning signs and find themselves changing or evolving their behavior at those certain times or doing things to help mitigate the effects of the abuse. We know that most often domestic violence does not start with violence on the first date. Most often, abusive and controlling relationships start with a stage called love bombing. At the beginning of the relationship, everything seems perfect, maybe even a little too perfect. You have found someone who showers you with attention, love, gifts, validation, and affirmation. You feel special, needed, loved, valued, and worthy. The intention of these behaviors is to use excessive attention, admiration, and affection to make the other person feel dependent and obligated to the relationship. It is a manipulative tactic used to gain trust and rapport to build the relationship. Then we move to the initial honeymoon phase, which is generally the first 6 months when the love bombing continues. They do everything to maintain trust and create heavy dependency through love and validation. From the false honeymoon phase, we move into tension building. This phase is often described by survivors as walking on eggshells. Tension, stress, power, and control is building, and the survivor is trying to mitigate the situation by avoiding possible violence. Emotional, mental, and financial abuse can also occur during this stage of the cycle. Then we have the explosion phase. This is where the abuse occurs or explodes. The abuse is triggered by anything, everything, and nothing. This is also oftentimes when law enforcement is involved. The survivor may fight back, leave, press charges, and seek a protection order during this phase. Then we return back to the false honeymoon phase. Here, the relationship returns to a seemingly peaceful and romantic relationship. Forgiveness is requested and oftentimes given. The abuser typically uses love and romance to manipulate the survivor into returning or staying in the relationship, with hopes that it won't happen again or that the abuser is genuinely sorry. The false honeymoon phase will once again begin to fade over time, and the cycle will begin all over again. On average, survivors of domestic violence go through this cycle 7 to 8 times before they leave. This is because what holds the cycle of violence together is denial. This can look like minimization of the abuse, acting like the abuse did not happen, or as if it will never happen again. While some survivors experience a cycle of violence in their relationship, other survivors may not. Additionally, the cycle does not look the same for every survivor or every domestic violence situation. When victims experience a cycle of violence and when they are experiencing power and control in their relationship, it impacts the wiring in their brain, which also impacts their thinking, judgment, and behavior. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about how domestic violence impacts our brain mapping. Based on the information we have, things we have learned, things we have witnessed, and past experiences, our brain creates maps, mapping some things and some people to safety, and some things and some people to danger. For instance, we map dolphins to safety and sharks to danger. This is a survival mechanism in our brain so that when we are faced with a shark or a threat or danger, we are quicker to take action that will help protect us and keep us safe. It is a survival instinct. Another example, we oftentimes will map strangers to danger, and we map people we love, trust, know, and care about, so family, friends, significant others, to safety. But when we are talking specifically about domestic violence, the perpetrator is someone we know and have a relationship with, someone we care about, someone we love, we share memories with, we share things with, and maybe even a family with. So when one of these people does something to hurt us, it causes confusion in our brain because we were taught that these people are safe, that these people are not dangerous. So now I do not know what to do. I do not know how to respond. So oftentimes survivors shut down. They stay. They find something that they did wrong. They justify the abuse. They blame themselves. They please and appease the abuser. They tend and befriend the perpetrator. This is because their brain is confused. Most often, bonding and attachment will override our threat response until we remap that person to danger, which takes having multiple threatening experiences with that person. That is why, on average, survivors go through the cycle of violence 7 to 8 times before they leave, because it takes that many times for their brain to remap that person to danger. To think about this concept in another way, let's pretend that we are on a walk and we come face to face with a bear in the woods. Our brain would automatically see that bear as a threat because of what we know about bears, just like how our brains will respond to sharks because of what we know about sharks. It will recognize that we have to take action quickly if we want to survive, and it'll dump a bunch of chemicals into our bodies so that we can act quickly and survive. This is a very primitive function of our brain, which has evolved so that we can survive different threats in our environment. During an experience of trauma, our bodies take any action it can as a way to protect us from potential harm. The response our bodies have depend on how severe we perceive the threat to be, how much power we have to take action, and our past experiences with trauma. This is great when you see a bear in the woods. But what about when that bear comes home every night, or sleeps in your bed, or eats dinner across from the table from you, or is someone you love and you care about? When someone is constantly exposed to their perceived threat stimulus, or is constantly in and out of their trauma, their fear center in their brain is constantly alerted and their stress hormones are elevated. Trauma impacts our body like a car that is constantly revving and accelerating its engine. It exhausts our system faster. This long term can have significant mental, emotional, and physical effects. It will make it harder for a survivor of domestic violence to utilize their normal coping mechanisms. It makes it more difficult to have a sense of control over themselves and their environment. It makes it harder for them to maintain their connection with others. It'll impact their brains, their bodies, their perception, and their behaviors over and over and over again, which will then compound their trauma. Trauma, like domestic violence, physically changes the brain. When it comes to intimate partner violence, it is important to talk about a phenomenon that we call trauma bonding, or you may know as Stockholm Syndrome. This occurs when a certain hormone is released during a traumatic experience, causing that sensation of good feeling and connection to help mitigate the emotional pain and the physical pain of trauma. However, this hormone is also a bonding hormone. So it, in many cases, causes a survivor to become bonded to their abuser or their perpetrator. We know that abusers use tactics of fear and violence, along with times of care and kindness, to reinforce these trauma bonds. Through the cycle of abuse and trauma that we talked about earlier, our brains release this hormone to help our bodies cope, to help mitigate and alleviate the physical and emotional harm being done. But with this release of these chemicals, our brains also form connection and attachment to the person that's causing us harm. These bonds are then reinforced by the periods of love, care, and affection that occur throughout the exploitation and abuse. The intense ups and downs of an unhealthy, abusive, and exploitative relationship, with the constant release of oxytocin and the withholding and sharp increase of dopamine, can cause a survivor's brain to almost become addicted to the high highs and the low lows and associate this cycle with love. The fights, the breakups, the extreme events bring the survivor closer, even if it comes at the expense of their own wants, needs, mental health, and safety. Trauma bonding, in addition to many other factors, is why survivors stay with their abuser, why they do not leave. If we do not understand how trauma can impact a person's brain, then we will not understand the victim's behavior, which can cause us to jump to incorrect, harmful, and damaging conclusions. Why do you stay? Why don't you just leave? These are some of the most common responses to the issue of domestic violence, and it is something that we hear all of the time. Sometimes even the survivor themselves may not have a true understanding of why they stay. But when this question comes up, we have to think to ourselves, what is really being asked of the survivor? It is being asked that they take responsibility and accountability for someone else's behavior to stop the abuse and the violence. Remember, survivors do not have control over the abuser's choices and the decisions, and are oftentimes made to feel powerless in the relationship. So we are going to watch a video in which we will hear directly from survivors on why they stayed and the complex and dangerous dynamics that played into their experience of abuse that made it unsafe for them to leave. This video is emotional and discusses real stories of domestic violence, so please practice self-care as we play the video.
It is the question that I'm asked the most. Why did I stay? Why does any woman stay? And for the life of me, I can't understand why people are obsessed with it, because to me, it's so obvious. Why does anybody stay with somebody that they love? You know, we've all been in relationships that even if they weren't abusive, we're not working any longer, and we all stay far longer than we want. And you stay for the same reasons. You stay because you love the person, or you love what you used to have, or you're trying to take care of your children.
When we ask, why did you stay, we're blaming the victim for their abuse, as opposed to asking, why did you hit this person? Or why are you violent? Or why do you feel the need to be violent?
Why would somebody abuse? Why would somebody beat the people who love him or her most on earth? Until we ask that question, we won't be able to obliterate domestic violence. We have got to focus on the perpetrators of violence, not the victims.
It's cliche, but he really was Prince Charming. He was very kind and sweet and nice. I left what I was doing to come and be with him, and I was alone with him. I didn't have any friends or family in the area. I couldn't find a job, so he paid the bills. And so we got into an argument, and that's the first time that he hit me. He actually threw me up against the wall and started to choke me. And I didn't really understand what was happening because he was not that person all this time. And so when he finally let me go, I thought it was something I did. I wasn't thinking to run. After we got married, it didn't stop. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I felt like I was trapped. At that point, we had moved from where we were across the country again, and I was further isolated. I didn't have any friends or family, and essentially, he still was the breadwinner. I was dependent on him. So if I left, what was I gonna do? Where was I gonna go? How was I gonna take care of myself? I felt like no one would understand, and I felt like no one would care.
The first full-out physical attack was 5 days before the wedding. Part of me knew I had to leave him right then, that I couldn't marry somebody who had done this. But then this other part of me said, but wait, it was one time. And I told myself he'd never do it again, that I was sure he was very sorry, and I didn't leave. I married him.
You stayed with this guy.
Yeah, I didn't have a choice. I mean, he told me, and I absolutely, that's the part that always it's so interesting to me. When it's like, the standard question: why did you leave? Why did you leave? Why did you leave? Well, he was trained by the United States Marine Corps to hunt people down and kill them, and he told me if I left, he would hunt me down and kill me. That's why I didn't leave. I used to pull what he would call my disappearing acts, and that would be I would, get the boys and get out, because it just was getting too intense. But I would always go back because at least I knew where he was. At least I knew the routine. I knew what to expect. But, it's a terrible way to live, to always be looking over your shoulder. He didn't start out with being abusive. He started out with being incredibly sweet and incredibly attentive and incredibly thoughtful and incredibly kind, and saying things to me that no one had ever said, and paying attention to me in ways that no one ever had. And I was really taken by it.
One of the reasons why we stay is because the behavior is such a drastic change from the person we met in the beginning. And we're constantly looking for the man in the beginning instead of concentrating on the man that is in front of us. Once I understood that, then I made the decision, I gotta go. This is not the same man I married. I mean, I love him, but he's gonna kill me.
With every violent moment, I felt further connected to him in this kind of twisted way. I felt that, we had this secret that bound us together, and that this was something big and we were working on it, and so we had to stay together until we worked it out. The violence got to a point where I realized that I could die. I had to create a plan. I had to figure out where I was gonna go and how I was gonna get there and who I was gonna reach out to for help if there was any. I was scared. I was afraid that he would find me. I was afraid that he would be so angry that I left, that he would come after me. I couldn't just get up and walk away.
And it was the most terrible feeling to know that I could leave and I still couldn't leave because I was bound by this psychological trap that I thought was love, that wasn't love. You know, I had so much denial. If you had come to me and said, "Are you being physically abused?" You know, if my doctor had asked me or a best friend, I would have said, "No, I'm not being physically abused."
You do feel isolated and you keep a lot of secrets. You know, you keep a lot of secrets in your heart, in your home, in your head. I stayed because I believed him when he said he wasn't gonna do it again. I stayed because I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have any money. I didn't have access to any resources. I stayed because my religious community convinced me that I couldn't get divorced because God would hate me. I stayed because I loved him. You know, I stayed because he was the love of my life, and I wanted to believe that love could conquer all, including abuse.
So these are just some of the reasons we heard from the survivors who shared their stories in that previous video, but this is certainly not an exhaustive list. I'm sure that as you watched that video, you heard examples of power and control, of the cycle of violence, and of trauma bonding. Survivors of violence face many barriers to accessing resources and safety. We also have to take into consideration that survivors of color and survivors within marginalized populations experience disproportionate rates of violence and increased barriers in seeking help and support. These barriers include fear of the criminal justice system, lack of financial safety nets, religious and cultural barriers, fear of deportation, lack of awareness or knowledge of the legal system, lack of adequate childcare services, lack of low-cost housing options, and skepticism of social service institutions. So instead of focusing on why a survivor stays, we should be asking that person who batters, why are they hurting someone else? Why are they abusing someone else? Only then can we truly address the root causes to the epidemic of domestic violence. It is also important to understand that for a survivor of domestic violence, leaving the relationship does not mean that the violence and the abuse will stop. In fact, many abusers escalate their tactics of violence during and after separations, or when they perceive they are losing some power and control over the victim or the survivor. This could happen during a breakup, filing for separation or divorce, moving out, going to a safe shelter, asking for help, filing a protection order, filing for citizenship status apart from the abuser, filing for custody of the children, and more. In these moments, survivors are at the highest risk of intimate partner homicide, specifically if the abuser has access to a firearm or a gun. This is especially important to note for Native and Indigenous women, Black women, and trans women. We also have to remember that trauma completely overwhelms our capacity to utilize our normal coping skills. It floods the road to rational thought. It impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, process reactions, problem solve, and utilize our higher level decision-making skills. A survivor's brain is completely overwhelmed. Therefore, it inhibits their thinking and their judgment. This is why sometimes victims and survivors engage in behaviors that don't make sense to us, such as waiting to report, not reporting at all, going back or continuing contact with their abuser or perpetrator, displaying emotions that don't quite line up, not making eye contact, or just wanting to return to normal. When we are working with survivors, we have to consider that there may have been multiple victimizations that they have experienced. Maybe they have reached out multiple occasions that we are not aware of and got nothing, or instead maybe they were silenced. From trauma comes a variety and array of feelings. There is no one way to experience abuse and to experience trauma. And from those feelings come behaviors, or what we see. Once again, victims and survivors of domestic violence may engage in behaviors that don't quite make sense to us. And we, as systems and as professionals and community members and friends and family members, we respond to the behavior that we see. And sometimes those responses aren't very helpful. Sometimes they can be hurtful. Sometimes they can even re-traumatize that survivor. But when we look to trauma as the source of the feelings and of the behaviors and go there for answers, things tend to make a lot more sense. We may not know what or when or how survivors are triggered, especially if we are not asking the right questions. The arrows on this diagram show that trauma causes feelings, which impact behavior, which elicits system responses to that behavior. Our responses, in turn, impact the survivor's behavior and feelings. If a victim survivor is seeking help and support, maybe for the very first time, and they are met with blame, shame, and doubt, how likely will they be to seek support the next time or to seek help the next time? So, how can we respond to disclosures of violence and abuse in a way that is free of shame and blame? First, we can offer the individual words of support and solidarity. Solidarity begins with caring, saying things like, "I'm so sorry that this happened to you." The survivor should be told that no one deserves to be hit or hurt. Validate their feelings. It's all right for you to feel betrayed, hurt, or angry. Questions you might ask could include, how are you doing? How are you sleeping? The second is vocalizing your concerns for their safety by asking questions like, are you safe? Or what would it take for you to be safe? This is also where referral is essential and information to be repeated. The survivor should know the name of the hotline and be aware of the resources available in their community. Listen to your gut. If something seems off, or if there are some red flags, it is okay to say things like, "Can you tell me more about that?" And the third component is empowerment. Reassuring the survivor that it is possible for them to reestablish concern over their life and that they do have choices. Asking questions like, what can I do? What decisions have you made so far? What are your concerns? Emphasizing to the survivor, I believe you. I care about you. I'm so glad you told me. You are not alone. Violent behavior towards you is never appropriate or deserved. It's okay to feel afraid. I'm so glad that you survived. It's okay to be angry. You deserve a non-violent life. You are not responsible for your abuser's behavior. You have the right to make choices. You are not to blame. You have the right to privacy. You did not deserve what happened to you. Very rarely can you talk someone out of their pain. However, being heard helps being hurt. Acknowledging the pain, the trauma, the injustice, and the experiencing by listening and holding space. We do not expect you to be experts or provide advocacy or counseling services to victims and survivors of domestic violence. But what we do expect is that you all start implementing ways in which we can create safe and calm environments for victims and survivors we come in contact with, a place that is free from shame, blame, doubt, and judgment. We do expect you to work with your local domestic violence agency. Lean on them for support when you are not sure what to do. Refer to their agency often. Keep brochures and hotline cards on hand. One of the most crucial things we can do is hold space and listen to understand, not to respond or fix the situation. Allow time and space for the survivor to process without silver lining the situation, without asking a lot of questions, without giving advice or jumping to solutions. The goal of listening should be to hear what the survivor wants and needs and what they do not want and do not need, and to understand how the survivor sees their own situation. They may refuse your help or deny that anything is occurring, and that is okay. Understand that it can be very frustrating sometimes, but we have to just pocket that frustration we may be feeling because this moment is not about us, it's about the survivor. Even if the survivor rejects the offer for assistance, you have supported them by affirming some of their feelings. You have also opened the door for a confidential conversation in the future. Following the survivor's lead, you can offer practical assistance and a different point of view. Understand that as an outsider looking into the situation, you are probably seeing it and perceiving the situation differently than the person who is directly experiencing the violence. Let them know that when and if they are ready, that there is help available. Keep brochures and hotline cards on hand for people who may need advocacy support and services. If they are ready to seek help, you could offer to call the hotline for them or accompany them to your local agency. Thank you so much for tuning in to this session of an overview of domestic violence. If you are concerned about your relationship, want to support a friend or loved one, or if you just have questions and want to talk, advocates are available 24/7 via our free and confidential helpline at 1-888-822-2983. To learn more about our services and to connect with our mission, please visit our website at www.ywcaneks.org or our social media pages. We do not do this work alone. Our power comes from the women, children, families, and survivors we serve, and the generosity and support from our community.